Something rather extraordinary happened this week at the Pentagon. The United States military, the most powerful fighting force in human history, effectively told its commander-in-chief that it would not follow his orders. Not in those words, of course. The Pentagon rarely speaks in language that direct. But the message was unmistakable, and the implications are staggering. Because when the military brass look at a presidential directive and conclude that obeying it would violate their oath to the Constitution, we have crossed into territory that should concern every single person watching this, regardless of where they sit on the political spectrum. The order in question involved deploying active duty military forces against civilian populations on American soil. Not the National Guard assisting with a natural disaster, not military police securing a federal installation, active duty combat troops directed toward American cities, with rules of engagement that senior Pentagon officials concluded were incompatible with the Posse Comitatus Act and, frankly, with the basic principles of a functioning democracy. So what exactly did Trump demand? Why did the Pentagon refuse? And what does it mean when the last institutional guardrail between an authoritarian impulse and its execution starts to buckle under pressure? Those are the questions we need to examine carefully, because the answers reveal something deeply troubling about where America finds itself in February 2026. By the time we work through the evidence here, you will understand not only what happened behind closed doors at the Pentagon this week, but why this moment represents perhaps the most dangerous constitutional confrontation since Watergate. And unlike Watergate, there is no guarantee that the institutions will hold. Let us start with what we actually know. Reports emerging from multiple credible sources, including the Washington Post, Reuters, and several well-placed defense correspondents, indicate that President Trump issued a directive through the National Security Council instructing the Department of Defense to prepare operational plans for deploying active-duty military units to several American cities. The stated justification centered on what the administration characterized as an unprecedented breakdown of public order connected to ongoing protests against the administration's immigration enforcement operations. Now, protests against aggressive immigration raids are not new. They have been escalating for months as the administration's tactics have grown increasingly confrontational. But what changed this week was the scale and the coordination. Simultaneous demonstrations erupted across more than a dozen major cities after reports surfaced of ICE operations targeting schools and hospitals, locations the agency had historically treated as sensitive. The images were predictably incendiary, families separated in school car parks, elderly patients questioned in hospital waiting rooms, the kind of footage that generates not just protest, but genuine public fury. Trump's response was characteristically escalatory. Rather than acknowledging that perhaps raiding schools might provoke a reaction, the administration framed the protests themselves as the problem. The language shifted rapidly from demonstrations to organized insurrection in official communications, a rhetorical escalation that should alarm anyone familiar with how authoritarian governments manufacture pretexts for military intervention against their own citizens. And here is where it becomes critical to understand the specifics of what was actually ordered. According to Pentagon sources speaking to Reuters, the directive did not merely request military planning options, which would be unusual but not unprecedented. The directive instructed the preparation of deployment orders with an operational timeline measured in days, not weeks. It specified units from the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne, America's rapid deployment combat formations, the same units that deploy to active war zones. And most alarmingly, the proposed rules of engagement included provisions for crowd dispersal that senior military lawyers concluded exceeded lawful authority under domestic deployment constraints. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who has generally been among the most compliant members of Trump's cabinet, found himself in an extraordinary position. The Joint Chiefs, led by figures who take their constitutional obligations with a seriousness that sometimes feels almost quaint in the current political environment, presented a unified assessment that executing the directive as written would place military personnel in legal jeopardy and potentially violate the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, the foundational legislation preventing the use of federal military forces for domestic law enforcement. Now, Trump and his allies have spent considerable energy arguing that the Insurrection Act provides an exception broad enough to drive a tank through, if you will pardon the rather apt metaphor. And technically, the Insurrection Act does grant the president authority to deploy federal troops domestically under specific circumstances. But those circumstances require conditions that even the administration's most creative legal minds struggled to manufacture from peaceful, if large and disruptive, protests. What the Pentagon effectively told the White House, through channels carefully designed to avoid the appearance of direct defiance, was that the military would require formal invocation of the Insurrection Act before proceeding, that such invocation would face immediate legal challenge, and that commanders on the ground could not guarantee their troops would execute orders that military lawyers had flagged as potentially unlawful. This is an absolutely extraordinary development. Compare it, if you will, to how other militaries in other countries have handled similar moments. When the Turkish military refused orders during the 2016 coup attempt, the world understood that as a pivotal constitutional moment. When Egyptian generals chose not to fire on protesters in Tahrir Square in 2011, that decision altered the course of a nation. Now, the comparison is imperfect. America is not Turkey or Egypt, but the fundamental dynamic, a military establishment concluding that civilian leadership has issued orders incompatible with constitutional governance, that dynamic is recognizable and it is profoundly serious. The reaction from the White House was predictable in its fury, but remarkable in its recklessness. Trump took to Truth Social within hours, posting a series of statements that essentially accused senior military leadership of insubordination. One post described the Joint Chiefs as Obama generals more loyal to the deep state than to their commander-in-chief. Another suggested that military leaders who refuse presidential orders should face consequences, a statement that constitutional scholars immediately noted carried disturbing echoes of authoritarian purge rhetoric. And this is where we need to understand the broader pattern, because this confrontation did not emerge from nowhere. It represents the culmination of a systematic effort to test and erode the boundaries of presidential authority over the military. Since returning to office, Trump has taken several steps that, viewed individually, might seem like mere staffing decisions or policy preferences, but viewed collectively reveal a deliberate strategy to transform the military from an institution bound by constitutional constraints into a tool of personal presidential power. The early retirement of several senior officers who expressed reservations about domestic deployment scenarios. The appointment of political loyalists to key liaison positions between the Pentagon and the White House. The systematic undermining of the military justice system's independence through executive orders modifying the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The expansion of the Insurrection Act's interpretive framework through Department of Justice memoranda that have not been made public, each step individually defensible perhaps. Collectively, they constitute the groundwork for exactly the kind of confrontation we witnessed this week. Professor Rosa Brooks at Georgetown Law, who served in the Pentagon during the Obama administration and has written extensively about civil-military relations, described the situation to the Financial Times as the most serious civil-military crisis in modern American history, and she is not prone to hyperbole. What makes her assessment so striking is its implication that the constitutional framework governing the relationship between civilian political leadership and military command authority is being stressed beyond anything its designers contemplated. The international reaction has been telling as well, and this is the dimension that most American coverage has underplayed. When allied nations observe the American military refusing presidential orders, even justifiably, they must recalibrate their entire assessment of American reliability. NATO partners, already shaken by Trump's erratic approach to alliance commitments, now confront the possibility that the American military and the American president might not be operating from the same strategic framework. That uncertainty is, for adversaries like Russia and China, an intelligence gift of incalculable value. Consider what this looks like from Beijing's perspective. The American military establishment has publicly signaled that it considers certain presidential directives unlawful. The president has publicly attacked military leadership as disloyal. The chain of command, the foundational element of military effectiveness, has been visibly fractured. If you are a Chinese strategic planner gaming out Taiwan scenarios, this information fundamentally alters your calculations about American response coherence in a crisis. The same calculus applies to Moscow. Putin, who has spent years probing NATO's resolve through hybrid warfare and grey zone operations, now has direct evidence that the American command structure contains fault lines that could be exploited, not through military action against American forces, but through provocations designed to trigger the kind of internal American political crisis that paralyzes decision-making. Now, there are those who will argue that the Pentagon's refusal to comply represents the system working as designed. The military took an oath to the Constitution, not to any individual president, and when those obligations conflicted, they chose the Constitution. That reading is not wrong, but it rather dramatically understates the danger of the precedent being established. Because here is what nobody seems to want to say plainly. A functioning democracy should never reach the point where the military becomes the last line of defense against unconstitutional civilian orders. The system is supposed to have multiple redundancies: congressional oversight, judicial review, cabinet accountability, public accountability through elections. When those mechanisms have all been sufficiently degraded that only military refusal prevents authoritarian overreach, the system has not worked. It has catastrophically failed at every level except the very last one. And that last level is fragile. The officers who refuse this week will retire or be replaced. The precedent of military defiance, however justified, creates its own dangers. A president determined to deploy troops domestically needs only to find senior officers willing to comply, and history demonstrates that such officers can always be found if you look hard enough and promote selectively enough. This is precisely why the purge rhetoric from the White House is so alarming. Trump is not merely expressing frustration with military leaders who defied him. He is signaling his intention to ensure that next time the answer will be different. The replacement of Joint Chiefs members, the acceleration of loyalty-based promotion decisions, the expansion of political appointee roles within the defense establishment, all of these developments, which will receive far less attention than this week's dramatic confrontation, represent the real long-term threat. The historical parallel that keeps surfacing in expert analysis is not Watergate. It is the late Roman Republic, where the gradual politicization of military command transformed professional legions from instruments of state policy into personal armies of ambitious politicians. The parallel is imperfect, as all historical parallels are, but the mechanism is identical. When military leadership is selected for political loyalty rather than professional competence and constitutional fidelity, the institution ceases to function as a constraint on power and becomes instead its instrument. What happens next will be decisive. Congress has, thus far, responded with the kind of performative outrage that substitutes for actual action. Democrats have called for hearings. Republicans have largely defended the president's authority while quietly hoping the situation resolves itself. Neither response addresses the fundamental constitutional crisis that has been laid bare. The courts will inevitably be drawn in, but judicial timelines operate in months and years, while political crises operate in days and weeks. By the time any court rules on the legality of the deployment order, the political ground will have shifted beneath whatever legal framework the judges attempt to apply. Bringing all of this together, what we witnessed this week was not simply a policy disagreement between a president and his military leadership. It was the visible manifestation of a constitutional system under stress so severe that its continued functioning cannot be assumed. Trump issued an order that the military concluded was unlawful. The military, for now, held the line. But the president has made clear he views that refusal as a problem to be solved rather than a principle to be respected. The implications extend far beyond this single confrontation. Every authoritarian consolidation follows the same pattern: test institutional boundaries, identify resistance, replace resistant individuals, test again. The cycle continues until either the institutions prevail or the authority seeking to override them succeeds. What determines the outcome is not any single dramatic confrontation, but the slow, grinding, often invisible work of personnel changes, procedural modifications, and legal reinterpretations that gradually reshape institutions from within. America's allies understand this. America's adversaries understand this even better. The question is whether enough Americans understand it before the last institutional guardrail is not just tested, but removed entirely. It has come to something when the world's oldest democracy depends on the restraint of its generals to prevent the deployment of combat troops against its own citizens. That is not a system working. That is a system issuing its final warnings before something fundamental breaks. And when it breaks, as it may well do, those who cheered the loudest for strongman governance will discover far too late that the institutions they helped dismantle were the only things standing between them and the consequences of their own choices. Such is the way of these things. When the reckoning arrives, it will not announce itself. It will simply be the day when someone issues an order, and this time nobody says no.